Welcome to Dinner and a Movie with Santino Domani, the channel dedicated to alienating myself from my friends and family by immortalizing my unpopular political and social opinions through ideological, incoherent ravings thinly veiled as film reviews and meal tutorials. I am YouTube's least favorite, ugly, hate-filled movie critic, Santino.
Hey, I may be ugly and hate-filled, but what was the third thing you said?
And well, it's that time of year again when we begin to emerge from the days that, not unlike Jerry Nadler, are cold, short, and filled with sickness and misery. And in honor of putting in the rearview mirror the season that ushers in darkness, bitter cold, and stubborn viruses, we're going to be reviewing a film whose theme aims to plumb the psyche of the coldest of the cold, the most bitter among the bitter, and the most insufferable, ostentatious, booger-blasting viruses ever to plague humanity, the pretentious writer.
Call me a booger blaster. I'll blast a booger so hard that...
And we're going to be doing it through the use of, maybe not the most popular film in the Coen brothers' repertoire, but what I consider to be, hands down, the most underrated. Joel and Ethan Coen's 1991 dark comedy Barton Fink.
Barton Fink! Barton Fink!
Is a film seemingly dedicated to shitting all over the mysticism surrounding the complex and misunderstood writer so burdened and isolated by the weight of his own genius that not only is his escape from reality by way of his excessive drug and alcohol abuse excused by society,
writing's the only thing that's giving your alcoholism any credibility.
It's all but celebrated as the mark of a hero, sacrificing himself upon the altar of hedonism, so us finger-sniffing common mans in the lower middle class, who flail about so curiously under their ivory microscopes, can be blessed with such triumphs of the printed word as the Dalkey Archive and gonzo journalism. And not to mention Barton Fink delights in engaging in one of my all-time favorite pastimes, shitting all over Southern California and the emotionally vapid, morally corrupt way of life it seems to hold in such high esteem.
But there was this gang of 10-year-olds with guns.
Exactly. You're in L.A.
But everyone is driving around in cars shooting at each other.
That's L.A. for you.
But the air is green and there's no sign of civilization whatsoever.
He just won't stop with the social commentary.
And the people are all phonies. No one reads. Everything has cilantro on it.
And any time a film makes a point to throw that cesspool under the bus, well, sir, that's just fine by me. And what better way for us oil-changing, gut-rot whiskey-drinking, spider-squishing, worm-baiting, tea party for our daughter having, Columbo-watching, receding hairline-covering common men to wrestle our dignity back from the likes of the intelligentsia, twerking and dilating their way through their tenured positions within quote-unquote higher education, than by mocking and laughing at their quote-unquote values.
Walmart didn't even put chocolate ice cream in Juneteenth ice cream. Epic fail.
And doing so with bellies stuffed full of what is perpetually served as both the ruination and redemption of us grunts and kulaks languishing away within the confines of the proletariat. Beer and sausage. That's right, we're making Barton Frankfurters, which means we're whipping up some homemade beer cheese, frying some fresh peppers and onions, and throwing all that hot mess on top of some beer brats. So keep the Beano close, the fold-out sofa linens clean, and get ready to make like Amber Heard and blame the dog.
She had eaten Johnny's weed when she was a puppy and had bowel control issues for her entire life, among some other issues. It was, we regularly had to take her to the vet to try to figure out, well, what was wrong with this dog.
Now, without further ado, Henry Spencer goes to Hollywood.
Okay, Fink. Let's chow.
Hey, were you there when I farted?
New York City, 1941. A simpler time. A time that didn't lend itself to much of the ambivalence and unpredictability that we often find ourselves grappling with in this brave and new current year of ours. Against this backdrop, we're introduced to the most uptight and anthropophobic humanitarian in human history, Barton Fink, who's recently found a modicum of success in New York City as a playwright. There's a problem, however. Whatever success he's achieved has left him feeling a bit empty because he knows he's competing in an arena that he doesn't belong in, not unlike a transgender woman taking second place in an actual woman's swim meet.
So much for Plan B.
In other words, all the affirmation Barton receives for his play is effectively meaningless to him because it's coming from the mouths of the very same vapid blue bloods and sycophantic know-nothings he's trying so hard to disassociate his writing from. Barton's place is with the common man, you see, because he so humbly looks upon himself as their champion for some reason, despite the fact that he can't seem to be within sniffing distance of one of them for more than half of a second without stifling the compulsion to morph into the 6.5 out of 10 from work you can't say hi to in the morning without getting a lecture from human resources about sexual harassment in the workplace later that afternoon. Feeling disenchanted that his play's success hasn't provided him with the sense of triumph he assumed it would, an opportunity to redeem himself, presents itself in the form of an invitation from Capitol Pictures, the motion picture company that serves as the gold standard for piping steaming hot loads of easily digestible, mind-numbing tripe down the throats of the common man, to write for them under contract for a boatload of cake stacks because, naturally, if you're trying to ensconce yourself deeper within the confines of your average working stiff scratching his way to a shallow, unmarked grave one quick pick ticket at a time, what better way than to write screenplays under contract for a major motion picture company for what would be, by today's standards, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month.
They've offered you $1,000 a week. I think I can get them to go as high as 2.
Unwilling to turn down perhaps his one and only shot at reigning on high as the king of the dumpster people, Barton promptly high and mighties himself on down to California and checks into Hollywood's answer to the Overlook Hotel, the Hotel Earl. It's desolate, bleak, and run down, but most importantly, it's common. And now that he's perfectly situated in his pit of squalor and isolation, and with a little encouragement from the owner of Capitol Pictures himself, Jack Warner, oops, did I say Jack Warner? I meant Jack Lipnick. Barton can now begin the impossible task of fleshing out the life of the mind, plumbing the depths, if you will, drudging up something good and beautiful by connecting himself to the wellspring of his creative flourishment, the common man.
Honey, did you put hubcaps on the lawnmower?
Yeah!
Why did you do that?
I don't know.
Which he might be able to do if not for the constant impromptu interruptions at the hands of the common man, with all his pedestrian real-world experience and lifetime of struggle and perseverance over adversity, finding himself with a rapidly approaching deadline, several reams of blank typewriting paper, and a bottomless gold mine of inspiration next door that just won't leave him the hell alone for 2 damn minutes so he can think of something to write about. Barton reaches out to the well-established and everly drunken charismatic Southern dandy William Faulkner. Oops, did I say William Faulkner? I mean William P. Mayhew. For a little professional literary advice about how to go about writing something for a lot of money without actually having anything even remotely interesting, original, or insightful to write about. Things really start getting interesting, however, when Barton shows up to WP's writing bungalow to discuss wrestling scenarios and other things literary. When lo and behold, who should answer the door but Katharine Hepburn? Whoops, did I say Katharine Hepburn? I meant Audrey Taylor, who's currently paying her dues as Bill's studio-appointed gopher, one grossly inappropriate indignity at a time. Barton finds himself instantly infatuated with Bill's young secretary, but there's a problem.
I'm not just Bill's secretary. Bill and I are in love.
Listen, you don't want no baby daddy drama. Trust me on this one, all right? Next thing you know, you the one going on the 1st and the 15th, to pick up the government check? What if he got boys that's on the outside and they stalking you? You see what I'm saying? You got to think.
And that's about it. That's your setup for Barton Fink. One man's struggle against the deadline, coupled with his half-hearted, prepubescent infatuation with the first woman he comes in contact with, who just so happens to be mistreated by a social superior. Yes, it's quite literally High School Freshman, the pretentious film, but with a critique of the institution of Hollywood interwoven that would make even Maynard James Keenan blush. And I know that all may sound rather uninspired, but I can tell you that it's no more egregious than a story about a man on a desperate search to replace a living room carpet that really tied the room together.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
So forget everything you think you know about Barton Fink, which I assume is nothing, and let me explain why. Set immediately before the second greatest tragedy in American history, behind only, of course, the burning of the Reichstag. Oops! Did I say the burning of the Reichstag? I meant, of course, the great trespassing of January 6, 2021, where, having been lured into a false sense of complete and total supplication under the assurances of one of the leading authorities on the subject of autocracy, that if us crop-dusting peasants ever tried to hold the government accountable for betraying its constitutional duty to uphold our rights, you know, like our constitutional right to be allowed to protect ourselves with a slick pair of bear arms, it would simply crush us with the might of its bottomless fleets of F-15s and stockpiles of nuclear warheads.
Those who say the blood of the patriots, you know, and all the stuff about how we're going to have to that there never been. If you wanted to think you need to have weapons to take on the government, you need F-15s and maybe some nuclear weapons. But the point is that there's always been the ability to rationally limit the type of weapon that can be owned and who can own it. The last time we had data on this issue of who was purchasing guns was more than 20 years ago.
No more questions.
The United States was aghast to learn that a handful of buffoons came this close to forcing those honest, lovable beacons of virtue and integrity we all adore and value so much, our members of Congress, from actually having to be within the general vicinity of those penniless helots they extort for wealth and power because they had the gall to amble about on some public property. Public property we, unironically literally, used to call the people's house during the stupid ages, which, of course, would have ironically literally and totally unfiguratively decimated democracy as we know it, not only going forward, but retroactively, ensuring that the freedom-famished, fledgling United States would remain pinned under the heel of the English monarchy, that we never would have stolen apple pie from the Dutch, and Rocky Balboa would have never brought down the Iron Curtain by beating Apollo Creed in a race to the moon. And may God bless and keep the American public school system as well. Now, where was I? Ah yes, set shortly before the bombing of the Pearl District's Harbor Freight in America's heartland, Portland, Oregon, and the United States' subsequent faceplant straight into World War II, Barton Fink is, not unlike its less satirical, but inarguably more well-esteemed doppelganger, The Shining, what's known as an isolation horror film. Like the one time I got drunk and woke up the next morning locked in a sensory deprivation tank, armed only with the knowledge that I hadn't somehow died and slipped into oblivion, because I had both a stabbing and pain and the theme song from The Facts of Life stuck in my head.
You take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the facts of life.
I knew I had either once again gotten myself trapped someplace awful because of my inflated ego, or I was, in fact, dead and somewhere deep within the bowels of hell. Such is the world Barton is alarmed to find himself trapped in. And what better place than Hollywood to impress the idea of hell on earth upon your audience? In addition to establishing itself as an isolation horror film through its oppressive and sweltering environment, Barton Fink also shines quite nicely as a dark comedy. And hey, there's no shame in admitting that, under the right circumstances, watching someone get hurt can be one of the funniest things there is. And for my part, there's nobody who does dark comedy better than the Coen brothers.
Good night, sweet prince.
And I'm happy to report that they don't miss a beat with Barton Fink. But why and how Barton comes to find himself in his own particular spot of bother is the most compelling aspect of the film for me, and why it's earned a place as a subject for review on a painfully unpopular film review and meal tutorial channel that's agonizing its way through its dying days with as much dignity as it possibly can, and all for no other reason than my wife and son seem to be the happiest when I'm either cooking, unjustifiably indignant, or in a state of pain or suffering that's the direct result of a hobby or interest of mine that should otherwise be making me happy. You see, in my opinion, Barton Fink is nothing if not a commentary on writing, writers, and the creative process in general. And bearing that in mind, you might not be particularly shocked to learn that creators Joel and Ethan Coen got the idea for the film while stuck in a creative rut during the filming of Miller's Crossing. If you fancy yourself a writer, much of the film might resonate as something of either an amusing, esoteric romp or a long, hard look in the mirror. I know it did for me in both instances, and also I found my wife giving me sidelong glances while I was laughing at the likes of antics at the hands of characters such as W.P. Mayhew, the eloquent, drunken southern gentleman, enabled by a battered lover, desperate for attention and affirmation, leverages an illegitimate air of self-pity and superiority as moral authority to drink enough alcohol to make even the likes of Nancy Pelosi shake her head in disgust. Put your work out there and allow your network of writing context to expand long enough, and you'll invariably meet the writer who uses the justification of being a literary powerhouse, regardless of whether or not anyone else actually knows it, as an excuse to overindulge himself on 750 milliliters of bottled permission to excuse himself from actually having to make an effort. And if you're listening to this, box of Franzia in hand, taking a much-deserved respite from the rigors of staring at a blank word processor in 2-minute intervals, and you're finding yourself without even the slightest clue as to what I might be talking about, or if you have no network of writing friends to draw from because you've been court-ordered to stay at least 500 feet away from them at all times, take care to ensure that you're not the one who's fallen prey to this trap which, for many, doesn't require much of a push to fall into. An unsettling notion which should terrify both aspiring and well-established writers alike. No, you know, Ernest Hemingway drank a lot and he was a brilliant writer. Yeah, that's true, but you're not Ernest Hemingway. And it's curious to me that when a drunken or drug-addled writer or artist produces something that's generally well received within the public, we as a society seem to reflexively associate that good work with their lust for debauchery. I'm not ashamed to admit that I used to do just that. We're certainly not short of popularized inebriates to look up to in this country anyway.
So long, Superman! There's a line in Othello about a drinker, now a sensible man, by and by a fool, presently a beast. That pretty well covers it.
Stop playing with yourself, Hooper. Here's to swimming with bow-legged women.
old sperm bank upstairs. Why don't you start right now and get the fuck out of here? Here's to 5 miserable months on the wagon and all the irreparable harm that it's caused me.
Here's the Union Oil. 100 miles of pipeline and all the independent producers of this great state. I say get liquored up and take them to the Peachtree Dams. You look like a fool, don't you, Topher?
Russell K, sir. And after Nam, I got into crop dusting.
When they took him up in the spaceship, the aliens abused him sexually.
Look, I've boned a lot of fat chicks in my time, sure. But as far as I can recall, I've never fornicated anybody.
I called you a fucking guinea homo from the 15th fucking century, you dickhead.
Why don't you get going? You'll be late for your Wizard of Oz candy bar at Yale.
Lollipop deal, you asshole. Jesus, 2-year-old flip me shit better than you.
Say it backwards, shitwit.
Let's go dancing. Papa loves parties, don't you?
I ain't drunk. If I was to want a free one, I'd want it with you, I guess, more than them other two.
We was young and full of beans.
Was it over when the Germans bombed Pearl Harbor? Hell no!
This situation absolutely requires a really futile and stupid gesture be done on somebody's part.
We're just the guys to do it.
Oh, we're afraid to go with you, Pluto. We might get in trouble. Well, just kiss my ass from now on!
Bill Mayhew, sorry about the odor.
It's when I can't ride. Can't escape myself that I want to rip my head off and run screaming through the street with my balls in a fruit picker's pail. Well, my whole factory's turning womanish on me, lying and deceitful.
Boy, Ed Bailey, you look like just about ready to burst. Very cosmopolitan. Nonsense. I've not yet begun to defile myself.
But now, looking back, I can't help but ask myself how much more of an impact such historically significant but prodigiously drunk people like Ernest Hemingway, Winston Churchill, and Margot Kidder would have had on the world had they not been handicapped by their insatiable lust for the creature. As for myself, however, I can tell you there's only one thing that terrifies me, Buster, and my blossoming alcoholism as the result of my inability to write anything meaningful or compelling isn't it. So I...
Wait, what's the thing you're terrified of?
Huh?
What's the one thing that you're terrified of?
Oh, cirrhosis. While the difficulties Barton faces as a writer struggling to make good don't necessarily stem from complacency by way of an overindulgence of alcohol, or any other instrument that enables its users to feel perfectly fine with being bored and stagnant for that matter, they do still, however, manifest from something that has the potential to be just as alluring and just as devastating, an overly preoccupying fear of mediocrity. And make no mistake, this isn't an affliction limited merely to writers or those who aspire to create in general. As a matter of fact, it seems to be an affliction that's taking a greater foothold in more affluent populations who are becoming increasingly repulsed by the notion that their wealth and comfort might possibly make them appear soft or uninteresting in the eyes of others. There's an anecdote I like to refer to when I try to assert this theory of mine to others. When I was a little guy, I had a pretty crippling condition by the name of nephrotic syndrome. I won't bore you with the details, but for the sake of my point, all you need to know is that my parents were under the impression that whether or not I was going to be alive for much longer was effectively a coin flip. So, my parents did what any parent would do for a vulnerable child fighting for his life with no guarantees of success. That is, at least before the age of entitlement. They spoiled the hell out of me. And having been 5 at the time, it never occurred to me that my parents might be treating me like I was dying. As far as I was concerned, I was being raised by my parents just like any other kid. In other words, I wasn't special. I wasn't a victim or a hero. I wasn't deserving of any special attention or affection. But here's the rub. I totally was. You know, because I was dying and all. Until one day, the clouds parted, the sun beamed down, and some selfish, insensitive doctor ratted me out and, like the entitled, pretentious bastard that he was, told my parents that the latest urine sample confirmed that the tide was changing, my condition was improving rapidly, and there was no reason to think that their beautiful baby boy wasn't going to fully recover and go on to live a long, healthy, normal life.
Oh, crap! It's a miracle!
To which my father, with a knowing smile, a glint in his eye, and an almost palpable aura of vigor and jubilation I had never seen in him before, looked down at me and said, "You hear that, you little fucker? Free ride's over." Well, suffice it to say, life took a bit of a funny turn after that. All the extra attention went away. Just because I wanted something was no guarantee that I was going to get it anymore, and I began to notice that other children who were getting the kind of attention I had become accustomed to previously were, at least to the best of my understanding anyway, either downtrodden to some degree or excelling at something to some degree. And the more I paid attention, the more I understood that excelling meant, like, hard work and stuff, which was for me, of course, entirely out of the question. To be downtrodden, though, well, I didn't have to do much of anything, really. Being sick? Hell, I loved being sick. Being sick was the best. Being sick meant staying home from school. Being sick meant The Price is Right. The Bob Barker Price is Right, where the host wasn't afraid to flip some of the stupider contestants a little shit.
5 numbers. You've written 1930. No, Joy. Now, come on. Let's go. You're going to lose your turn if you don't write. You used the 1 twice there. Now, you've used the 1 here twice. Here are the 5 numbers. Using those 5 numbers, write it down. 200, you've used the 1 twice. You've used the 1 twice, Joy. Look, write down here. What do you want to write? You want to write 19,000? Write it down. Write it down. 19,000. Now, you have the 3, you have the 2, and you have the 0 left.
Or look you square in the eye and demand that you cut your best friend's nuts off like only Bob goddamn Barker could. Being sick meant special attention from Mom, even if she was really stressed out about closing the Vermont deal. It meant baseball games, parades, art museums, a tender, loving reconciliation with my less charismatic, bitchy older sister who, as it turns out, just needed someone to listen and let her know that they cared. But oh no, what's that? I had a cough and a runny nose. You know what I didn't have? Gym class, as well as the open showers, towel snappings, and bottomless assortment of clever ways for a young man to manipulate his genitals to look like kitchen appliances and farm equipment that invariably followed.
Oh, shit! The goat! The goat, you bastard! Oh.
In other words, school was mediocrity. It was par for the course, boring, common. Being sick, being a so-called victim on the other hand, it was liberating, exciting, and wildly and wonderfully interesting and unpredictable.
9-0. No, you won.
But as time went by, going to school day after day, year after year, knowing that I could forego the banality and drudgery of it simply by being lucky enough to fall prey to some mild illness, I began to view school as something far more sinister than what should otherwise be a commonplace event, neither inherently bad nor inherently good. The problem with that, of course, is that what going to school looked like for me, a healthy, middle-class young boy living in an affluent, homogeneous community, when compared to nearly everywhere else throughout human history, was nothing short of a miracle, wrapped in paradise and covered in the fry sauce that came with the chicken tenders they served in the cafeteria every goddamned day. So, just like everyone else who hasn't had to try and put their lives together after having crawled out of some pit of suffering, victimization often comes in the form of new and bizarre quote-unquote struggles, at least in the eyes of those who have, anyway. Well, that's relativism for you, and it's why we have people here in the States crying themselves to sleep because government-backed shock troopers aren't dragging people out of their homes and beating them to death in the streets for the great crime of refusing to acknowledge and celebrate a person's self-ordained identity as a carrot cake or whatever. And it's here where I think the film Barton Fink ties into all this business about relative suffering quite nicely. You see, Barton wants to write a story. The story about the struggles and sufferings of the common man.
Well, I don't mean to get up on my high horse, but why shouldn't we look at ourselves up there?
But as much as he likens himself as one of them, and aspires to champion himself as their messiah of sorts, leading them out of the stifling desert of TV dinners, malt liquor, and payday loans into the hallowed halls of pretentiousness, completely unfounded indignation, and fancy table mustards, it's painfully evident that Barton has absolutely zero interest or intention of actually subjugating himself by associating with the likes of common men like Charlie Meadows. And it's not like he's exactly shy about it either. At the beginning of the film, he looks at one of the stagehands like he's a soiled diaper. He refuses to shake hands when Charlie introduces himself, and scoffs at his whiskey when it's offered as a genuine effort to establish a neighborly rapport. How dedicated is Barton to immersing himself within and better understanding the muse he's so vocal about advocating for? Well, as a matter of fact, he's so dedicated that the moment that very same muse opens its mouth, the first thing Barton can think to do is complain about it and do whatever he can to shut it up. As a matter of fact, it's only when he gets an opportunity to bluster on about himself does he seem to start to open up to Charlie at all. Barton wants to write a story about a big man in tights, but he fails to give even the slightest interest in the compelling one living right next door to him, despite the fact that he's all but screaming it at him.
Hell yeah, I could tell you some stories.
And that's the point, that we all have stories.
I could tell you stories to curl your hair, but it looks like you've already heard them. And I could tell you some stories.
Sure you could, and yet many writers do everything in their power to insulate themselves from the common man.
You see, her hubby was out of town at the time, and they were carrying Fire and Life. The third quarter payment was way past due.
You know, in a way, I envy you, Charlie.
Well, I can tell you some stories.
And so it tends to go with many writers, it seems. It's easy to lose sight of the story when the clickety-clack of the keyboard compels one to type "all work and no play makes Sonny a dull boy" over and over, or when he allows himself an 80-proof reprieve from the rigors of critical thinking and crafting rich, structured storytelling because he's simply too crushed under the weight of his own genius, and the only reason success eludes him is for no other reason than he's simply too far ahead of everybody else intellectually. So, naturally, no one understands him. Well, I understand you, asshole, and let me be the one to break your heart and tell you that there have been tens of thousands of accomplished writers throughout history, and if I had to venture a guess, I would say that only a small handful of them were what any one of us might call a quote genius. The unfortunate reality, much to the chagrin of those who aspire to make $1 billion sitting in front of their computers, writing rage fantasies about the ritual murders of the people they have to work with at the Cracker Barrel, is that there has never been and never will be an undisciplined and lazy accomplished storyteller. Creating an engaging, introspective, and perhaps most importantly, compelling narrative for people to fall into takes a considerable amount of knowledge. Knowledge that can only be acquired through investigation, experience, careful observation, realization, and then, more often than not, and most certainly the most taxing, deep reflection and abstraction about the implications regarding your newfound knowledge. And, damn it all, that necessitates having one of the rarest and most difficult character attributes a person can ever hope to develop. That jewel of a gift most often disguised as the tattered rags of weakness. Humility. Humility is the kick in the balls that facilitates the path to wisdom. It's the sting that comes with putting down the donut and picking up the barbell for the long-term goal of looking good in that hot two-piece in June. A pain I'm, in fact, all too familiar with. A lack of humility invariably fosters complacency, which is, without question, the death rattle of creativity. And Barton Fink swims in it like so many self-perceived intellectual titans who think that, regardless of whatever environment or situation they might find themselves in, they're naturally above it all.
I am a creator! This is my uniform! This is how I serve the common man! This is where I
And it's Barton's inability to self-reflect that ensures that he can't take responsibility for his inability to connect with the world around him and say something interesting about it as a writer. Did you hear that? You know who you are? Oh, for the sake of comedy, let's call you Larry. Contrary to what Anderson Cooper and Don Lemon might have told you, it's negligent to point a gun at someone you don't intend to shoot, especially when you have your big, stupid booger hook on the trigger like some recently divorced middle-aged beef and cheddar sandwich showing off a recently purchased Taurus PT22 on her new YouTube channel.
Oh my god, I don't think I could do that. Oh, sorry.
With some stupid self-aggrandizing name like Breathing Again or Life After Fidelity. You know what happens when you do that?
What happens, Larry? That's what happens, Larry! That's what happens, Larry!
People tend to get shot. I'm pretty sure you used to know that once, sometime long ago, before you stopped using your head to think and started using it as a cock holster for Stephen Colbert. Hell is Charlie's home. Barton's just a tourist with a typewriter. Charlie has to be there, while Barton is merely dipping his toes into Charlie's hell of a home for a lark, for a chance to understand something nobody in their right mind ever really wants to truly understand. They don't actually want to endure the rigors of a difficult, but totally interesting or whatever, life of suffering. They simply want to exploit it to liberate themselves from the harrowing scarlet letter reflecting a life of comfort, entitlement, and most terrifying of all, mediocrity that we tend to metaphorically sew on the lapels of self-important, daydreaming loafers like myself who've been blessed with the time, alcohol, and bottomless pit of frozen bean and cheese burritos to stare out the window, make up silly stories, and lecture the hard-working 9-to-5ers holding the civilization together about how they need to forget everything they know about Twin Peaks and The Cosby Show on account of the fact that it's not actually the Jews subverting the country, but rather a crafty band of space lizards cleverly disguising themselves as the sons of Zion in an intricate plot to keep me from ever actually catching a goddamn decent-sized Chinook salmon off of the riverbank. I mean, son of a bitch, seriously, how hard could it actually be to outsmart a fucking fish? The point is, it's egregious enough that Barton has the audacity to storm into Charlie's home and humiliate the likes of roughnecks like him by claiming to want to put a stupid, wage-slaving peasant like him into a petri dish so he can parade himself around as their voice and savior.
Would you like to know more?
But what's worse is that Barton makes it expressly clear that he actually has no intention of writing anything meaningful about Charlie because he has absolutely zero intention of actually trying to understand Charlie. I was kidding earlier, by the way. It's totally the Jews.
Just kidding, but not really.
Ironically enough, all this happens despite a genuine desire on the part of Barton to make a difference, which, in my opinion, underscores the idea intertwined within the film that almost everyone wants to make a difference. To be a hero, an innovator, a leader, a brilliant writer, the kind of person people genuinely look up to and admire. But when confronted with the reality of what sacrifices are usually associated with achieving such success, they're quick to reevaluate how high on their priority list achieving that success actually is, abandon it, and then look for another way to gain the kind of attention and affirmation that's often associated with being exceptional that doesn't demand things like sacrifice, discipline, talent, motivation, creativity, humility, patience, introspection, and self-reflection, or empathy or understanding. Barton touches on this in what I think is one of the most insightful, thoughtful, and poignant lines ever written in cinema history.
No, I've always found that writing comes from a great inner pain. Maybe it's a pain that comes from a realization that one must do something for one's fellow man to help somehow ease his suffering. Maybe it's personal pain. any rate, I don't believe good work is possible without it.
You see, at the very heart of writing, of storytelling, that is, abstracting human suffering, happiness, love, hate, frailty, perseverance, at the heart of any story worth hearing, or worth telling for that matter, is conflict. Conflict with an idea, or with change, or an institution, or an all-star team of international terrorists, or with nature, or even conflict with himself.
I'm kicking my ass! Do you mind?
And if any storyteller is going to be honest with himself and his audience and wants to do a good job saying something unique or compelling about what it means to be a human being, perhaps something we feel deep inside of us, but it wasn't until someone put the proper words to it that we could really be taken in and moved by it. He has to immerse himself deep within that conflict he's trying so desperately to understand, master, and then communicate. There's no other way, and immersing yourself within that conflict is rarely not a very ugly, sordid business. And it's often why great writers are traditionally seen as distant and deeply conflicted for no apparent reason, or as out-and-out batshit insane. They're living, or at least attempting to live, with a perpetual tug-of-war going on inside their head, creating sympathetic characters occupying opposite positions of complex and often painful issues, and at the same time making each one of them beloved, hated, right, wrong, vulnerable, or unstoppable, but most importantly making them understood, each one with their own life story, their own scars and trinkets they carry with them, love's hard won, and the same love so much harder lost. Espionage and violence, excitement, and the unfamiliar, a universe of possibilities just waiting to be lived, contemplated, and perhaps with the proper courage, drive, and discipline shared as a means to, like Barton says, help your fellow man traverse this ridiculous and improbable journey we all find ourselves taking together. Now, having said that, I don't want anybody walking away from this review under the impression that they can't possibly enjoy Barton Fink unless you majored in being a douchebag at Lesbian State University with a double minor in living in San Francisco. And even if you're not all that interested in writing or storytelling in general, if you're familiar with much of the Coen brothers' work at all, then you'll know that these two knuckleheads probably aren't going to have much of a hard time putting a smile on your face. To nobody's surprise at all, John Goodman gives a powerhouse performance, and fans of the directing duo's more popular work who, for one reason or another, never gave Barton Fink a fair shake, I think are going to be pleasantly surprised by John Turturro's range in this film.
I am very, very sneaky, sir.
That is, when they do decide to finally give it a go. Ever the goofball, that is, at least for what roles I and countless others had come to know and love him for anyway, Turturro makes with the laugh, but in something of a more sophisticated and thoughtful way that seems to complement him quite nicely. But I think what impresses me the most about Turturro's performance in Barton Fink is how he seamlessly brings to life the chaotic war unfolding within the trenches of his character's mind. And sure, I understand that that kind of behavior is going to vary dramatically from crazy person to crazy person, but speaking for myself at any rate, some of his deliveries were downright uncanny at times and resonated pretty close to home. I know there's been more than one occasion when I've been nipple deep into the meat and potatoes of a new writing project, and my wife's walked in on me standing in the middle of the room with this stupid look plastered across my big empty Gulliver. She'll more than likely ask me how long I've been standing there, and I'll more than likely respond with something like, "Yeah, that sounds great." And then when she invariably asks me if I'm okay after a long, uncomfortable silence, I'll hit her with one of these gems.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Are you sure?
No.
But without question, the two performances that had me tickled the most are coming from John Mahoney as W.P. Mayhew and from Michael Lerner as Jack Lipnick. And what kind of heartless monster could ask me to pick my favorite between the two? Michael Lerner portrays a character who, I can only assume, is largely based off the cartoonishly evil president and driving force behind the Warner Brothers studio at the time, Jack Warner Sr., who, as legend has it, actually had the costume department at Warner make him a colonel's uniform he could strut around the studio in after the Germans bombed Harbor Freight.
German? Forget it, he's rolling.
And I can say without hyperbole that Lerner gives one of the most spirited and entertaining performances I've ever seen in a film.
And I don't mean my dick is bigger than yours. It's not a sexual thing, although you're the writer, you know more about that. Coffee?
He serves as one of the most critical devices within the film that drives home one of its central themes about the stark contrast between a writer's grand and noble ambitions to change the world for the better by sitting on his ass and daydreaming all day, and the aspirations of producers and studio executives to sell tickets and keep people coming back for more. more, both of whom with their own unique brand of underlying hypocrisy that eventually comes to surface for all to see. And speaking of hypocrisy, that brings us right along to W.P. Mayhew, who serves as a delightful parody of Kentucky Fried Wordslinger turned Hollywood Harlequin William Faulkner, who, as it happens, actually wrote a wrestling picture by the name of Flesh in 1932 for true-to-life behemoth of the silver screen Wallace Beery. And if that wasn't enough to convince you of the intended target of the fraternal filming force, it might also interest you to know that another writing credit Faulkner lays claim to for his tenure in Hollywood is that of Slave Ship, a title which also happens to appear on the outside of W.P.'s bungalow when Barton meanders over for a visit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there's certainly no shortage of famous drunks popularly portrayed in film as the super cool badasses they absolutely are, but I have to say that, with the exception of Val Kilmer's portrayal of Doc Holliday in the film Tombstone, W.P. is by far my favorite.
So now I'm supposed to roll over like an old bitch dog getting my belly scratched? Yeah.
And to be fair, I think that has quite a bit to do with the fact that W.P. represents, how should I say, a kind of person I find particularly reprehensible, and also with the fact that the Coens, channeled through the brilliant acting of Mahoney, systematically ridicules and belittles this malignant tumor on the ass of modern storytelling quite nicely. And lastly, it simply wouldn't be right if I didn't take a moment to applaud the set design and cinematography that really helps tie the film together. The Coen brothers do a masterful job in Barton Fink creating an environment that feels isolated, constricting, and worst of all, and by worst I mean best, stifling, and not merely in terms of temperature, which the film does quite well, but also in terms of an air of repression that seems to always hang around in the film. The half-told stories Charlie begins but is never allowed to finish, or the very idea that Barton, who as a writer prides himself, as every writer should, on his innovative and original material, is struggling to bridge the insurmountable gap that exists between writing a successful, painfully formulaic wrestling picture and writing, as he puts it in his words, a new and beautiful wrestling picture. And if ever there was a word I would use to describe the inability to put what I perceive to be an innovative, unique, and interesting idea into words that everyone else might be able to understand and enjoy, that word would absolutely be stifling. And it's for this reason why I try and be as careful with my words as I possibly can, and because it affords me the opportunity to sit, reflect deeply on subjects and ideas that I think are important, and organize them in such a way that I can communicate them effectively to others, is precisely why I love writing as much as I do. It also just so happens to be why I have no friends, and my family refuses to engage with me in any sort of meaningful conversation because every time I open my mouth, without having had 2 months to think about and revise what I'm about to say, I come off as a pretentious, ball-gargling know-it-all. Now, as much as I'd like to dive right into a diatribe about the importance of being concise with language, the sharp tingling radiating up and down my left arm would suggest that it's about time for me to start wrapping this turkey up. But before I do, I'd just like to very quickly reinforce the point that when the Coens were brainstorming ideas about the best locations to metaphorically represent hell, Los Angeles invariably rose to the forefront of the list.
They call Los Angeles the City of Angels. I didn't find it to be that exactly.
And god damn it, I didn't want that to be lost on anyone. For many, the ending is convoluted, chaotic, and unintelligible, much like the Darrell Brooks trial, which I could effectively sum up thusly.
Well, check this out, though. First of all, you're throwing too many big words at me, okay? Now, because I don't understand them, I'm going to take them as disrespect. Watch your mouth.
Like I'd mentioned earlier, the film takes one hell of a pivot in both emotion and tone at the beginning of the third act, and from there the chaos and confusion only continues to spiral downwards, both figuratively and quite literally, until the very last frame. Taking care not to give too much of the film away for those who've yet to see it, I'll say that there's a point in the film where it becomes abundantly clear that any expectation of a suspension of disbelief on the part of the audience up and takes a long walk off a short pier. In other words, the metaphorical instruments used on the part of the creator become so abstract and unbelievable, those in the audience can only surmise that what they're seeing on the screen isn't, or could never, happen in reality. Perhaps it's happening in a dream, or, I don't know, some sort of hypothetical, supernatural plane of existence where the apotheosis of human suffering and hopelessness is depicted. And of course, that's what we're seeing towards the end of Barton Fink, a metaphor. Which is great, I have no problem with that. Rich metaphor, in my opinion, lies at the heart of all brilliant storytelling. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say that that the way the film plays out is wrong or poorly executed, or that it even sours the movie for me on some small level. However, I will say that this pivot away from the trajectory of the original story is so sudden and so unexpected that if you're unable to disassociate whatever emotional attachment you might have had with Barton or Charlie, as well as how you came to know them up into the third act, by not recognizing the apparent madness for what it's supposed to represent, it very well might be enough to put you off the film completely for no other reason than out of frustration that you feel like you're watching an entirely different film all of a sudden. But never mind what I think, I'll go ahead and let the Coens have their say by posting a link to an interview they did with Dick Cavett, back when Dick Cavett was a guy, where they take the time to expand on the mayhem a bit. I know I was happy to hear their take on what was intended, and I really don't think it's anything that would put most people off the film, especially if they went in having a better idea of what exactly it was they were getting into. It's easy to want to embrace victimhood when you haven't even the slightest idea of what it actually means to be a victim. And when being a victim means bottomless attention, affirmation, and representation for no other reason than you've prioritized your lifestyle choices around a fear of appearing mediocre or uninteresting in the eyes of others, that is, until whichever victim of the month fad that's currently being glamorized by BuzzFeed eventually grows stale, and in the end, the only thing that you've actually done is made yourself more hated than an adult in a John Hughes film occupying any sort of position of authority.
Go suck your head.
Barton Fink is a film that accentuates the point that it's especially easy for writers to fall into this trap. After all, who has a more compelling and interesting story to tell than a victim? But more to that point, it's been my experience that the greatest writers and storytellers weren't great because of the size and the scope of their experience necessarily, but rather because of how they were able to reflect upon that experience, extrapolate something meaningful from it, and through the careful implementation of powerful writing tools like metaphor, prose, and humor that have been sharpened through countless hours of study and practice, communicate it in such a way that makes people actually want to hear it. It's a lesson that hit me harder than student loan payments hit a humanities major after graduation. And if you're anything like me and are not content to steal other people's work, repackage it as political propaganda by playing 3-card Monty with the skin color of the protagonist in the source material.
20 on this one, my good man.
Sorry, dude. Black.
Homer, he cheated, Joe.
And then have the balls to accuse anyone who doesn't think plagiarizing the hard work of others is morally defensible of being literally the most reprehensible thing there is, ever was, or ever will be. Nope. Not even in the ballpark, sunshine. You got it, bucko. Then I recommend you give Barton Fink a fair shake. I think you'll be glad you did. Alright, well, that's just about all I can stomach for one video. I hope this little entertainment helped to divert you in your sojourn among the Philistines, and I hope to see you on the next one. But until that day, this is Santino Domani saying, take care of yourself, and if you can, take care of somebody else.
For both of our sakes, I'm glad your time is up.